Hi, my name is Sue Carter. I'm from Toledo, Ohio, and early in the 80s, I went to a speech by a writer named Barbara Ehrenreich. I went with my ACLU friends, and I thought, this makes sense. And I kind of like the ACLU. I really like what they stand for. I'd like to look into this. So an older gentleman came up to me and he said, we're looking for young women. We ought to diversify our board here. So I went to a meeting and I never left. You know, that's exactly how it happened. I was involved in so many peace movements where we'd go to meetings and we'd stand around for 2 or 3 hours and never get anything done, but talked about peace and war. ACLU was run by lawyers. You know, you had Robert's rules, you got out on time, and you got business done. It just made sense to me. So I stayed with the ACLU and the local chapter for many, many years and was asked to be on the state board. When I got on the state board, I loved how it was run. I loved what they were teaching us, and I loved the activism of the people on the board. What was neat, they weren't all lawyers. There were activists, there were librarians, there were social workers, and a great diversity of people from different parts of the state. And the nice thing was we learned, we talked, and we shared time, and they were functional meetings. I wanted to be president just because I wanted to run the meetings and listen, not to talk, but to make sure that everyone had equal time, no one spoke twice before the other person spoke, that we got out on time, and people said, oh, that was a good meeting, we got out on time. And I think I did a good job doing that. We've had some great presidents on the board, and I hope I carried on with that. It's a pleasure to have been with the ACLU all this time, even though I'm not on the board. I mean, that's what I do for my life, is to be an activist, and the ACLU is the activity that is in my life every day as I think about the injustices that are going on now. So the ACLU, it gets in your blood and it becomes who you are.
Today is Thursday, July 19th, 2018, and we're here in the ACLU of Ohio Cleveland office with Sue Carter, a longtime social justice activist, board member, and supporter of the ACLU. Sue has dedicated her life to fighting for everything from veterans to the environment, but the causes closest to her heart are the rights of the LGBT community and women's rights and reproductive freedom. Your interviewer today is Meghan DeVol, an intern with the ACLU of Ohio. Sue, thank you so much for being here today.
I'm glad to be here.
Let's start with a few background questions. What was your childhood like?
It was very ordinary with working class parents, but my mother was particularly special because she was a socially minded woman. She believed in equality before it had a name like that. I mean, she was born in 1916. So we watched on television the integration of schools. She showed me what it looked like to yell at little children. She said, this is the face of hate. And she showed me the men that were yelling at kids trying to get into school. She talked about the McCarthy era and explained to me how people were blacklisted. She used to cry at John Garfield movies because he was an actor that was blacklisted and died of probably drinking and a broken heart, according to her, because he couldn't make movies because of the McCarthy Red Scare. So anybody that was different, like we are now, that believe in liberal causes, was red-baited and couldn't get work. So that's how the environment I grew up in, with my mother showing us those kind of injustices.
And your mother was obviously very socially conscious.
Yes.
And exposed you to social injustices at a very young age.
Yes, she sure did.
Was she an activist herself?
Not at all. She was a mom that, well, her activism was Girl Scouts, raising young women to be open-minded, liberal, thinking and kind, but she never got into any activism other than voting for a Democrat.
When did you have your first interaction with the ACLU?
I went to a talk by Barbara Ehrenreich, and I wanted to hear her speak. I'd heard her, read her writings, and she was very interesting, and the ACLU was putting it on in Ohio, on Toledo, Ohio. So I asked some friends that were in the ACLU to take me, and I was fascinated by the ACLU because it made sense. You know, the Bill of Rights, it made sense. And I went to the meeting, and I expressed an interest, and because there was no one young and a woman on the board except lawyers, they really wanted to diversify. So they asked me to be on the board, and that's when I first started with the ACLU.
You've lived in Toledo your entire life, correct?
Right.
And you went to the University of Toledo.
Mm-hmm.
So what made you want to stay in Toledo?
Probably it cost. I could live at home and go to school, and I had to work while I was going to college. That was my friends. You know, I love to travel, but I never wanted to live anyplace else. It seemed to work just fine for me.
And you attended the University of Toledo for both your master's degree and your bachelor's degree. Your bachelor's was in art.
Yes, I wanted to be an artist.
And your master's is in social work.
Well, actually, counseling.
Counseling, okay. So what influenced the dramatic shift in those interests?
Well, so I got a degree in art in 1969, and I wasn't really that talented. I went to an art school. I mean, the University of Toledo had an art school. It was fantastic. And I realized, compared to other people, I really wasn't that talented. So I got a degree. I took my degree, and I was working in retail to get through school. And they were opening a new Sears Roebuck. Can you imagine fashion and Sears Roebuck? But that's the job I got, as fashion coordinator for Sears Roebuck. I also decorated saws and household appliances and things like that. And then another company opened called the J.L. Hudson Company. It was out of Detroit, and it was a big corporation company, and very tooty, you know, good stuff, you know. And I got a job there. It was wonderful. But everybody there, this was in 70. Everybody there was in display. I got to be a display person. They were all men. And I was happy to work there. Everybody was a man, almost everybody was gay, and it was a great job. It was fashion, glamour, fashion shows, parades in Detroit, everything. And then what happened was I had a boss that had moved from San Francisco, and he was telling me he was having these terrible headaches. This was in the early 80s. He was having these terrible headaches, and I said, "You've got to go to a doctor." He went to a doctor. He never came home. He never came back. I filled in for him. He went to a hospital. I called him. He didn't even know who I was. He couldn't remember who I was. So the hospital was calling me constantly saying, "What are you using at that store?" We had feathers from Bangladesh and baskets from Nepal. And they were asking, where did these things come from? They couldn't figure out why he was so sick. He was wasting away, and he died. And we were just shocked. And no one ever said why. Now we know he had AIDS. He had to. He probably had cryptococcal meningitis or something in his brain, and they couldn't figure it out. So when he died, they asked me if I'd take his job, just because nobody else wanted to come to Toledo. They never had a woman display manager in 100 years of the J.L. Hudson Company. I became the first woman display manager. That put me in a real interesting position, because they didn't quite know what to do with a woman. Like, they would say, "Well, you're a woman, so you don't have to stay up all night and do the parade in Detroit, the Thanksgiving Day parade." Of course I do. I want to be there. You know, it's fun. I went to all the conferences for display, like in New York shows, and I went with the guys, and we went to gay bars afterwards. I mean, it just was what I did. But also I learned from my friends was how hard it was to be gay. Now, we're talking in the 70s. Some of them were married, but you knew they were gay, and I don't know how much closeted they had to be, but they had to be somewhat. Others that were open about it were estranged from their families. We were told that some people were told that they had to have electroshock therapy. That was something that was promoted, that they had to get right with God, that they should get married, or they were shunned. It was really awful. I was also in the women's movement, where I was in the National Organization for Women. A lot of my colleagues there were lesbians. So you heard what a backlash there was about that. So as I was working at Hudson's, I began thinking, I can't do this. You know, I can't be dressing dummies in fancy clothes while all this injustice is going on. Meanwhile, I met my husband, who was an activist as well. So I went back to school to become a counselor, so that I could be a gay-affirming counselor. And I got my second degree, my master's degree, 20 years later, to the day that I got my first one. So meanwhile, while this was going on, and while I was doing this, HIV came to Toledo. And my best gay friend, my friend Harold, told me one day, he said, "I just got tested for HIV at this hospital, the one I work at now, and I'm positive." I went, "Yeah, I've heard of that in San Francisco, but gosh, you're so young." And he said, "Yeah, well, I'll just get sick. I won't get sick." Well, in 1993, he died of AIDS. I was a social worker, and I got hospice for him in his home. I watched him deteriorate. This is before the good meds, and it was awful. But also, I saw hundreds and hundreds of people, because I got a job as a social worker at the AIDS clinic, which is what I wanted to do. I won't call it AIDS anymore because it's HIV, but in those days it was AIDS and you died. So as soon as I got out of a school for my master's, I started working as a volunteer. I worked above a gay bar, and I was a buddy for people with HIV. And I got the job I wanted. I wanted to be a social worker at the HIV Ryan White Clinic, and I've been there since 1991.
So can you tell me a little bit more about the work that you do there and why you feel it's so impactful?
Oh, it's just the best job. Because the people that do that work, because we've all been there a long time, early on, the people that wanted to work as either volunteers, there were a lot of volunteer agencies that would work with people with HIV, and there was the hospital. We were the people who thought there's nothing wrong with being gay, there's nothing wrong with being a drug user, there's nothing wrong with being a person of color, and there's nothing wrong with having AIDS. And that was all our patients. It was people that other people didn't want to deal with. And we just thought it was outrageous, so we all just wanted to do something to be effective on it with a population that was being shunned.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the litigation, some of the litigation that the ACLU and the ACLU of Ohio has been involved in. And you told me about a case called Charon v. Hall.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what that case was about and how you were involved?
Fred Charon was a young man from New York who had HIV. And he was coming through with his partner through Ohio on a trip. He got sick and he went to a hospital, Fremont Memorial Hospital. He should have been admitted, but the medical director of the hospital, Dr. Hull, would not admit him. His reasoning was, and it was recorded in the medical record, and that's why there is a case. He said, if you get an AIDS patient in this hospital, you'll never get rid of him. Send him to Toledo. The only hospital that really was actively working with HIV was the hospital I worked at, the University of Toledo Medical Center. They put this young man in an ambulance, probably at his own expense, and sent him to Toledo. It took an hour of wasted health care time. Got into our emergency room, and luckily it was just a reaction to a medication. He took some Bactrim, antihistamine thing, was fine and went on his way. But meanwhile, his partner was infuriated, and since that time, Fred Charon died of AIDS. His partner was incensed at how his lover was treated, so he called the New York ACLU, who referred it to the Ohio ACLU, and it came to Toledo because Fremont is a small town near Toledo. It was a wonderful David and Goliath case. Here's the heartbroken lover pleading for justice for his dead partner. Here's 3 volunteer attorneys from the ACLU. Here's Fremont Memorial Hospital with the very smug Dr. Hull and all his cronies. Here's the big law firm and all their people. And then there's all these young people that are going to be working at this law firm. So there's this big side of lawyers. And there's Mr. Charon's lover, ACLU people. There's a jury of all white people from the area, rural Toledo. What do they know about AIDS? What do they know about lovers? What do they know about this situation? This is the early 80s. Maybe it's a little later than that, but still, HIV was a new thing, and it was, we won. We won the case. The people saw injustice where it was, and it didn't matter how much power or how much money the other side had. What was remarkable about the case is not only the victory, it was the first American with Disabilities Act victory for someone with HIV. And the ACLU was very, very much a part of pushing for the ADA to contain injustice, inequality, and rightful treating for people with HIV. And that's how it got into the ADA, because of the ACLU and other people. So it worked out really well. And it was a really wonderful victory. And I would go down at my lunch hour because Mr. Charon, if he'd ended up in our hospital, he was on my list of people to see. Luckily, he was healthy enough to leave, which was not like a lot of the people that came to our hospital at that time.
So you're obviously very satisfied with the outcome.
It was a wonderful outcome. I wish they all worked that way.
Where do you believe that this case falls in the fight for LGBT rights?
Technically, it falls in a great place because of the ADA connection with rights for people with HIV. And in those days, it was gay men that you were seeing most. The other part of it is it tells you about how if you give people the right information about injustices Good people will come on the side of righteousness, and that's what happened in this case. So I just think that is a thread of injustice, education, and righteousness that whole story about HIV in this case proves.
Another case that was litigated by the ACLU was the village of Skokie versus the National Socialist Party.
Yeah.
So can you tell me what this particular case was about and why it has meaning to you?
This was before my time in the ACLU, but it stood out at my heart. I mean, I can't really talk about that one without getting tearful because of the lawyer that took that. These Nazis wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, a very Jewish section of Illinois. And a Jewish lawyer, who we see all the time, David Goldberger, and he comes to things now. I don't think he knows he's such a hero. Anyway, he took the case in spite of the fact that many, many people left the ACLU because of that. And he was Jewish. I imagine that blowback that he got. And he was right. They had a right to march. And I thought, in my heart, even before being in the ACLU, we have to give free speech to everybody. So this case makes sense to me, and how hard it was for him to take that case. But he knew he had to do it. And the ACLU had to take it because that's who we are. We take hard cases. We're not always on the side of the pretty, And when people would argue about that, and I'm sure the ACLU made a good case for it, and we still lost members. If those Nazis can't walk, then your union can't walk. Then my peace group can't walk. Then your striking people can't walk.
So the ACLU believes firmly in freedom of speech and that First Amendment right, and they took that case to protect the free speech of the Nazis.
Of all of us, not just the Nazis, everybody's free speech.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what parallels do you see between Skokie, Illinois, and the happenings in Charlottesville just in 2017?
Boy, that's a tough one, and I think the ACLU and everyone involved looks through that case. But they did have the right to gather. They did have the right to protest the Nazis, but then guns are involved, and the young man that killed the protester is from my town. But people do have the right to protest, and I think that just means they have to be screened, be watched. I don't know, but we can't stop free speech because of maniacs and idiots. Violence is always out there.
Okay, Sue, so we've talked about Charon v. Hall and the village of Skokie versus the National Socialist Party. What was another case that the ACLU litigated that was important to you?
Well, I wanted to bring up Tinker versus Des Moines School. Mary Beth Tinker was a high school student back in the late 60s, and she and her brother wore black armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War. I think everyone knows the case. She won. Children do have a right to have certain rights even if they're in school. They were allowed to wear the armbands. It was a long case. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. What was so remarkable about the case is the fact that here's these two young people feeling that seriously about an issue, parents supporting them and winning. So if you go to the museum in Washington, there's a big panel with Mary Beth and her black armband and her brother has his black armband. They made history. That cemented their right of the right of students. It's a great free speech victory. And the neat thing about Mary Beth and what I want to say about activism, she is still an activist. We run into her at ACLU conventions. We've run into her at Veterans for Peace conventions. She's come to Toledo to speak about rights. She's involved in so many things that has never left her heart. As a child, throughout her life, she will always be an activist, always be an ACLU member, and continues to work on other issues because she knows what injustice is and she wants to fight for justice.
And how do you feel that this case helped you in your involvement with the ACLU?
I think it was a beacon, just like the Skokie case and the Tinker case. Here's individuals that are brave enough to step out front and make a case for an amendment or a right or to right an injustice, and that's just remarkable to see that happen. Not enough people are brave enough to do that. If enough brave people step forward, like Mary Beth, you can change the law, or you can make good law, or you can fight for somebody's right to have good health care or abortion rights or free speech. It's remarkable.
So So I want to move on and talk to you about your experience as an activist. You have a range of activist experience that's so incredibly broad. Can you give me a rundown of some of the organizations and movements that you've taken part in over the years?
What started, I think the first thing I ever did was such a failure. I love animals, and I was an animal rights activist. And there was something on the ballot where you gathered signatures, and it was for a leg hold trap. And there I had a picture of a little fox chewing off his leg, and I was going to people asking them to sign, and they didn't care. And I'm telling you, I still can't get signatures to this day. I stopped. I thought, if I don't want to know that people don't care that foxes have to chew off their leg because of the leg hold trap. My petition and that whole issue went down in flames because Ohio was a great trapping state, I found out. But anyways, that was so disillusioning, and it's very hard to go out there and be an activist and find out that people don't care. Getting involved with the ACLU and a lot of other movements, I was able to find out lots of people care, you just got to find them. So the first thing I did, I think, was probably the nuclear freeze. That's how I met my husband in the anti-nuclear movement, and that was back in 1980, 81, 82. We were all afraid about being blown up by Russia, so there was a nuclear freeze movement. I got arrested for the first time. I'm really shy. I mean, believe it or not, I don't like putting myself out there, but it gets so much easier when there's other people doing it. And the fact that my husband was there involved in most of the movements I was involved in, you just had to do it. The abortion rights movement, our clinic was firebombed. I used to go escort women into the clinics. I was very involved with NOW. We did all sorts of creative protests about women's rights and to have abortion. Still an issue. The peace movement, anti-war movement. I mean, we were very involved in the anti-war movement from everything from the invasion of Nicaragua to the invasion of Iraq. My husband and I both got arrested protesting Bush's shock and awe. There's always something, you know? There's always something. Any other ones? I'm trying to think of other. It's
labor.
Oh, I was very involved. I was in the labor movement. My first protest was Solidarity in Washington. I went with my union, Mike's union. Millions of people on the streets protesting for workers' rights. That's when Reagan was president. I think it's just injustice across the board. You can find something, and everything that touches your heart. Every time I think, I just can't get involved with that death penalty. I can't take on one more thing. I'm very involved in the anti-death penalty abolition movement, you know. So there's always something.
And you mentioned being part of the National Organization for Women and escorting women into abortion clinics, and that the clinic was firebombed in Toledo. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me some more about that situation? Oh,
that was such an active time, and again, it is now, but at the time we had an abortion clinic, and the protesters were very, very vocal in there all the time and harassing the women. I mean, I really believe they had the right to say what they wanted to, but they would get near the women and call them names, and we wanted to blockade that, so we would walk with the women into the clinic. And we did that, my husband and I and all of our friends in NOW did that on a regular basis. But I found, for myself, I couldn't do it anymore because I got so angry at the protesters. I found myself wanting to be violent and hit them. I mean, they were so mean, and I didn't like what it made me feel like. So I didn't stop being an activist, I had to stop being an escort. But we would do all sorts of creative protests. We had candle lights in a back alley. One time we would do marches. We did everything we could to bring attention to the fact that women had the right to do that, to have an abortion, a safe abortion. They also, after the clinic was firebombed, it was shut down. The second clinic was certainly harassed. The doors were glued shut. There was always something going on.
Considering your history with the women's pro-choice movement and your membership in the National Organization of Women, how do you feel about the state of women's reproductive rights today, especially considering the agenda of our current administration and the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court?
Well, two things. I think each state is going to have its own fight, and I think women are much more galvanized than they were in those days. I think the majority of people would be on our side if there was a vote. I think it's embedded in law enough that maybe we'll get through this without having our rights taken away. But also, women are very creative, and if our rights are taken away, we'll figure a way to do it ourselves. I hope it doesn't come to that. What kind of a country would this be if the government can tell women what to do with their reproductive organs? Give me a break. I mean, this, oh, don't even get me started. No.
So out of all of the rallies and meetings and protests you've attended, what has been the most memorable for you?
Oh, I was thinking about that question. I couldn't even tell you. They're all so different. The first one I ever went to was Solidarity Day. Here, I had never been to a rally before. Here's all these working class people in Washington protesting for the rights of unions. Oh, I couldn't believe it. Then I went to the Women's March. I helped organize 5 busloads from Toledo back in the 90s to go to protest for abortion rights in Washington. That's when Reagan was president. And then I went to one for the nuclear freeze. There was 1 million people in New York, and between the buildings, when people chant, it echoes back and forth. I mean, there's just so many, and I think the crowning glory, although it was when one week Mike and I went to protest at the Republican nominating rally and the Democratic. This was all about the wars, the war in Iraq and anti-war movement. So we got on a plane and went to one, came home, cleaned up, went to the next one.
So Mike is here with us today, and you guys kind of seem like an activism power duo, from what you've told me. So could you tell us more about your partnership?
We met in a movement, and that seemed to be the thing that, you're always looking for someone in a partnership that you agree with. And a lot of people get married to someone or hang out with someone or partner up with somebody that you love them, they're sexy, but you don't do those things together. To me, my heart is in fighting for justice. If I was with someone that didn't feel that way, I just wouldn't be with someone like that. That's who I hang around with, that's who I work with, that's who I live with. So the thing that we do together, like we had a meeting last night, we're just like a machine. You take this and I take that, and I take the projector, and you take the films, and I take the cookies. But the neat thing about it is, like, Mike went to Iraq for a couple months. A lot of people would say, you're leaving me to do everything at home and you're going to Iraq. I was great. I thought that was great. If I would take off someplace for weeks for a protest, that's what you do, you just do that. So those things have kept us together. It didn't matter what the movement was, if it was specifically mine, like AIDS is, or Veterans for Peace, which more his is. We support each other, so that just keeps things just lively all the time. I mean, we've never been bored, and we've been together since 1982, so.
So circling back to your involvement with the ACLU, how do you feel that being a part of the ACLU and being a board member and the longstanding president of the ACLU, how do you feel that has impacted your life?
The ACLU has been the thread through all of this. It's everything that you do, whether it's anti-war, that's not an ACLU position. It's about justice and equality. And that's what the ACLU stands for. Everyone should be treated equally. Everyone has the same rights. That isn't happening in the real world. That's what the ACLU stands for. Being a part of that movement, the ACLU movement, I was able to learn more about what's going on, what we need to fight against, the specifics, not what I hear on news, but what I hear at meetings locally, nationally, that the ACLU is bringing up to us. I mean, it's such an educational, anybody that cares about civil liberties should be looking at our website. Such good information. But in the old days, before websites, we had to talk to each other. We took cases, we explained them to each other. So the ACLU kind of just continued that thread that it didn't matter what the injustice was. ACLU is all about justice for all.
And what advice would you give to aspiring activists?
I would say, if you have a passion, if you're mad about something, or you see something that you don't like, or you think it's wrong, find someone else that cares about it like you do. Because if you're alone with that kind of frustration and anger, and you don't speak out, it's going to hurt you. You really need to speak out against injustice. So given that, speaking out alone is scary, and it's sometimes hard to do. So you find a few friends, you join a movement, get online, go to a meeting, join a protest. When you get with lots and lots of people that care about the same thing you do, suddenly you realize you're not alone, it's not so scary. When you do a picket line with 10, 15, 20 people, and you get in the media and you change something, or you make somebody see your point of view, it's very powerful. You can't do that by yourself, but a few good friends, a big movement, it's so much fun. Plus you have all the social activities of fighting for justice with other people that care about the same thing. You make great friends. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel good, and it's the right thing to do.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Sue. It's been wonderful talking to you today, and we're just so happy that you could be with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed myself.